Okay, let's dive right in. We're talking about something kind of weird about us humans today. Why we're so drawn to horror.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, we spend our lives trying to avoid actual danger, pain, all that.
Right. Get away from the scary stuff.
But then, movies, books, games. Suddenly it's like, yes, please, more monsters.
It is a bit of a puzzle. We're wired to avoid real threats, but we actively, seek out the fake ones.
And the source you shared, this really fascinating thesis on the philosophy of horror, it makes it clear this isn't new.
Yeah, not at all. This fascination, this pull towards the scary, it goes way, way back.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive isn't just why do we like spooky movies? It's deeper. Right.
Much deeper. We want to unpack what's really going on. What does this attraction tell us about, well, us?
Yeah. Let's get past the jump scares and look for the real reasons.
Okay, so let's rewind way back. The thesis points to some really interesting clues from early humans.
Yeah.
Think cave paintings.
Oh yeah, those amazing windows into the past. The thesis mentions the Cave of the Trois Frères, like 13,000 BCE.
That's the one. And deep inside these caves, not right at the entrance, but way in the back, alongside the usual animal painting.
You get these weird figures.
Exactly. Monster forms, the thesis calls them, like the sorcerer, part wolf, part bear, part human. Really unsettling stuff.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Ugh.
What were they doing, going deep into the dark to paint and maybe look at these frightening things?
It suggests a deliberate engagement with fear, even back then.
What was their relationship with fear like?
And the thesis draws this interesting parallel, suggesting maybe those ancient figures evoked something similar to how we react to, say, werewolves or vampires today.
Huh. So it's like this continuous thread.
A long history of being fascinated by the things that scare us.
So, okay, it's not just us and our modern gadgets. This has been around forever. Which brings us to the big question. Why does something negative like fear feel? Well, good sometimes.
The paradox of pleasure in fear. Philosophers and writers have wrestled with this for centuries. Your source brings up some great historical takes on it.
It's like everyone noticed this weird connection. Seneca, saying there's a kind of pleasure linked to sadness.
Exactly. And that old Gnostic text, Thunder, mentioning many pleasures exist in many sins, it hints at that complex mix.
And Alcinous, way back, saying even someone who's afraid isn't, like, totally without pleasure.
Then Giordano Bruno later on, noting that, well, human nature seems condemned to find disgust mixed with delight. It's quite a statement.
And even Moses Mendelssohn in the 1700s, observing that we often enjoy things that really should make us feel bad.
It's this recurring observation, our emotions aren't always simple on-off switches.
Right. It's not like these thinkers were saying, go find misery.
No, not at all. They were just acknowledging this complex dance within our experience, how negative feelings can sometimes be part of something we seek out.
It's not about wanting the real monster chasing you.
Definitely not.
But engaging with the idea of it safely, that can be enjoyable somehow. Which leads to another key point in the thesis. Horror isn't always just about the scare.
Precisely. Sometimes those frightening figures or elements are serving a different purpose entirely. The thesis gives some great examples.
Like the Green Knight. Arthurian legend, right? Big, imposing green guy. Definitely a bit unnerving.
He is. But the thesis argues his terrible features are supplementary. The story isn't really about him being scary.
It's more about chivalry, temptation, testing Sir Gawain.
Exactly. His appearance is, well, a vehicle for those themes of honor and integrity.
Okay, got it. And then there's that amazing Egyptian example, Emmett, the devourer of hearts.
Yes. Sounds terrifying, doesn't she? Part lion, part hippo, part crocodile.
Nightmare fuel.
Totally. But in the Book of the Dead, as the thesis explains, she wasn't just random terror. She upheld ma'at, order, justice, ethics.
How so?
She ate the hearts of those judged unworthy after death. So this horrific figure was actually enforcing the moral code.
So the fear she inspired wasn't the point. It was a means to an end.
Right. It was about conveying a spiritual message.
Yeah.
Live righteously or face a myth. It shows how, especially in religion, horror elements can serve these larger ethical or spiritual lessons.
Fascinating. Using fear for something other than just fear itself. And the thesis says philosophy has done this too.
Oh, definitely. Philosophers aren't above using a bit of the unsettling to make their ideas stick or to provoke a certain kind of thinking.
The thesis mentions Empedocles, using some pretty intense, scary imagery in his cosmology.
Yeah, describing the forces of the universe in ways that were likely quite terrifying to his audience. But it was to drive home his philosophical points about love and strife.
And Descartes, his evil genius thought experiment.
Classic example, the idea of a powerful demon constantly deceiving you. It's meant to induce radical doubt, right?
To make you question everything you think you know.
Exactly. The fear that deep uncertainty serves the philosophical goal of exploring the limits of knowledge.
And Hobbes, with his grim picture of the state of nature.
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Not a fun thought.
He painted it that way deliberately, didn't he? To argue for the necessity of a strong state, the Leviathan, to prevent that chaos, fear as persuasion.
So in philosophy, the horror is often a tool, a means to an intellectual end.
Which, as the thesis points out, is quite different from horror as entertainment, where the fear itself is often the main attraction.
Okay, so how did horror entertainment become so, everywhere, so accessible?
Well, the thesis traces that evolution. It starts, of course, with Gothic literature, then moves into the Victorian era, where ghost stories and the supernatural really took hold in popular culture.
Like Frankenstein, Dracula, all those spooky classics.
Exactly. People were clearly developing a taste for it. But the big shift came with technology.
Movies.
Movies, definitely, and television later. Plus, cheaper printing methods. Those pulp magazines made horror stories available to, well, almost everyone.
Right, it wasn't just for the elite anymore. The thesis mentioned some key films, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu.
Those early German expressionist films were huge. Then later, things like Freaks, Creature from the Black Lagoon.
And TV shows like The Twilight Zone.
Absolutely, and the big ones like Night of the Living Dead, The Exorcist. These weren't just movies, they were cultural events that cemented horror in the mainstream.
It's funny, though, because despite being so popular, the thesis notes that academic philosophy kind of ignored horror for a long time.
Yeah, it got the cold shoulder, didn't it?
Yeah.
The thesis suggests it was largely due to that old divide between so-called high art and mass art.
Horror was seen as maybe too lowbrow, too focused on just eliciting simple emotions like fear.
Pretty much. Not considered complex or deep enough for serious philosophical study. Think about Stephen King, hugely popular, but academics only really started taking him seriously much later.
And Hitchcock, too, right?
Yeah.
Master of suspense, but maybe not seen as artistic enough by some critics back then.
Exactly. It reveals a bit of a bias, perhaps, against art forms aimed squarely at popular audiences and strong emotional responses.
Which brings us to defining it. What is horror, really? How is it different from, say, just suspense or terror?
That's the tricky part the thesis tackles. Generally, horror as a genre focuses primarily on the emotion of fear. But distinguishing it from terror, for instance, gets complicated fast.
Is there a clear line?
People have tried to draw one. Noel Carroll suggested it often involves monsters and the nature of the threat, distinguishing horror from terror that way. But the thesis rightly points out that this definition feels a bit too narrow.
Like, what about Psycho? Or Poe's Telltale Heart? No supernatural monsters there.
Exactly. Most people would absolutely call those horror. Joshi classifies them as psychological horror. And Stephen King himself says horror aims for that deep sense of dread, the feeling that something is profoundly wrong and unnatural, which doesn't always need a literal monster.
The thesis lists some great examples of monsterless horror. King's Misery, with the terrifyingly human Annie Wilkes.
The Blair Witch Project, where the horror comes from being lost, hunted, the unseen.
Kafka's In the Penal Colony. Just the sheer nightmarishness of the situation.
Or Jackson's The Lottery, social horror. Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, psychological entrapment.
So horror can come from things that could happen. Physical trauma, getting lost, disturbed people, oppressive situations.
Absolutely. The thesis argues that depicting real-life possibilities can be deeply terrifying. What makes something horror is often the concentration on these horrible events.
Even if other themes are present.
Right. Like in Hardy's Jude the Obscure, it uses horrific events to underscore social critique. The horror is potent, even if it serves another purpose.
And sometimes it's subtle, just a suggestion.
Definitely. The thesis mentions Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains, or Dahl's Genesis and Catastrophe. The horror is implied under the surface, but incredibly powerful.
It makes sense. It's not always about gore and jump scares. Okay, another distinction the thesis makes. Horror versus disgust. They often go together, right?
They definitely overlap. Think zombies, body horror things can be both horrifying and disgusting. And they share some physical responses, like increased heart rate.
But they're not the same thing.
The thesis argues they are distinct emotions. And, interestingly, disgust has actually received more academic attention, maybe because it seems more biologically straightforward.
How so?
Researchers like Rosen, Haight, and Macaulay link discuss primarily to contamination, oral incorporation, basically, avoiding things that could poison or infect us.
Like rotten food or bodily fluids.
Exactly. And the key feeling, according to Korsmeyer, is often nausea, that visceral revulsion. Disgust responses seem pretty consistent across cultures, tied to basic senses.
Okay.
And fear.
Fear, the thesis suggests, is more flexible.
Yeah.
It's not tied to a specific sensory input like taste or smell. It can be triggered by subtle things, abstract ideas, threats to our safety or existence, not just contamination. So even in really gory body horror, the main feeling driving it might still be fear. Fear of bodily harm, decay, death.
That's the argument. The underlying driver is often closer to fear, even if the imagery is disgusting. Disgust is about revulsion. Horror is more about threat and dread.
Okay, this is all building a really interesting picture. We've got the history, the definitions. Now the core why. Why do we seek this out? The thesis focuses heavily on the catharsis theory.
Yes, this is central.
Yeah.
The idea is that experiencing horror in a safe context, watching a movie, reading a book, allows for catharsis.
Catharsis, like Aristotle, purging emotions.
Exactly. A purging or releasing of intense, potentially volatile passions. By confronting representations of fear and anxiety, the theory goes, we can process and release some of our own pent-up worries.
Especially worries about big things, like pain and death.
That seems to be the connection. The thesis links it to Aristotle's idea that art about universals, the general, is more philosophical than history. It suggests we learn about fear itself by engaging with these fictional portrayals.
And Burke's idea of the sublime fits in here too.
Right. Burke saw terror as the key to the sublime. He argued that seeing representations of terrible things without being in actual danger allows us to contemplate them and, in a way, relieve our anxieties about them.
Nussbaum even suggested horror presents an argument.
Yeah, an argument that can help us challenge unhealthy ways of thinking about our own vulnerability, about pain and mortality.
So it's like emotional training wheels.
Yeah.
Facing simulated fear makes us better at handling the real thing, or at least our thoughts about the real thing.
That's a good way to put it. It offers a controlled environment to engage with these fundamental anxieties without real-world consequences.
And the thesis argues these anxieties often boil down to our fear of pain and ultimately death.
That's a core assertion. Fear is fundamentally tied to anticipating pain, and that anticipation is deeply connected to thoughts of loss, non-existence, our own mortality.
That Montaigne quote the thesis uses is powerful existence as just a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness.
It really captures that underlying awareness. And Kierkegaard wrote about that specific anxiety, the dread of death and eternal oblivion.
It's natural to want to avoid death, but that avoidance creates its own anxiety.
Precisely. And horror, the theory suggests, gives us a space, a paradoxical one, maybe to actually confront these thoughts, rather than constantly pushing them away.
Can we see this catharsis idea in specific horror works? The thesis gives examples, right?
It does. Think about stories like Le Fanu's Carmilla or Blackwood's The Willows. The fear described isn't just negative. It awakens this tumultuous excitement or a sense of awe and wonder. Fear itself becomes transformative.
And Poe, always writing about death.
Obsessed with it, especially as he put it, the death of a beautiful woman as the most poetic topic. The thesis notes his exploration of survival after death.
And the premature burial seems like a perfect example.
Absolutely. The narrator confronts the ultimate terror, being buried alive, and through that extreme fear, finds a renewed appreciation for life. That's almost textbook catharsis.
What about cosmic horror like Lovecraft? Seems more bleak.
It is bleak, but the thesis suggests that the anxiety it generates about humanity's smallness, our insignificance in a vast, uncaring cosmos, prompts introspection. It makes us reflect on our place, our existence.
Even Kafka, like The Burrow.
Kafka's work often encourages reflection on existential dread, paranoia, the inevitability of something awful. And modern films like The Witch or The Lighthouse tap into these really primal fears about isolation, survival, the breakdown of order, all linked back to life and death anxieties.
So across the board, horror seems to keep circling back to these fundamental fears, giving us a way to process them.
But the thesis is thorough. It also tackles the objections. What are the counter-arguments?
Well, Pascal's point, why dwell on death if you don't have to? Just ignore it.
It's a reasonable question. But the thesis counters that, well, it's not always easy to just ignore these thoughts. They creep in. Horror, maybe, offers a structured way to engage with them instead of letting them fester vaguely.
What about the idea that horror is just bad for you? That it encourages violence or desensitizes people? Plato worried about that with art, didn't he?
He did. Concerns about mimetic violence have a long history, but the thesis argues horror usually doesn't glorify violence. It often makes us reflect on its consequences. And ultimately, interpretation lies with the individual. Stephen King called horror therapeutic, remember? An outletting and a lancing.
So facing fictional fears might actually refine our response to real suffering, make us more empathetic.
That's a potential positive outcome, yes. And then there's the pleasure aspect again. Bentham saw pain and pleasure as total opposites. How can fear be pleasurable?
The thesis brings up things like masochism.
Right. It points to evidence that the relationship between pain and pleasure is more complex than just simple opposition.
So the pleasure in horror isn't just relief after the scare ends.
The thesis suggests it's more than that. It involves the cathartic release, yes, but also potentially a changed attitude towards fear itself, a feeling of mastery or understanding gained through the experience.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up, it seems our strange attraction to horror isn't so strange after all.
Maybe not. It seems deeply rooted in how we grapple with the fundamental realities of being alive, our awareness of pain, loss, and mortality.
And horror, in its many forms, gives us this unique, safe arena for catharsis, a place to confront those big anxieties.
Exactly. It lets us process these things that are, frankly, difficult to face directly in everyday life.
This exploration, drawing on that thesis, really highlights the deeper motivations, doesn't it? It's more than just thrills. It's about our relationship with life and death.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Think about the kinds of horror that really resonate with you. What specific fears or anxieties do they seem to tap into? What might that tell you about your own way of dealing with impermanence, with loss? Definitely something to chew on.